Tanse Kakiao. Hi everyone, my name is Raven Sinclair and I'm a professor of social work with the University of Regina here in Saskatoon. Colonialism has taken a real toll on Indigenous people in Canada, and nowhere is this more evident than in the lives of Indigenous children. In the West here, our traditional nomadic buffalo hunting lifestyle came to an end, and in the early 1800s, our children were removed and placed into what was called industrial schools. Just after the 1840s, the churches got involved, and then our children were removed and placed into church run residential schools. This residential school era really served to disrupt and fundamentally alter our traditional ways of life. And we had to, contend with a new way of being in the world. And it's presented many, many challenges. So let's look at some of those traditional child rearing practices.
Our family was born into that family unit where my grandmother took everybody that she could take. Anybody that needed help, she'd take them in. So I was raised with always a full house of children. It didn't matter whose children they were. It could be neighbors or from another reserve. They would come and stay. And the only jobs they were was cutting pickets, stooking. That's all there was. And it was a woman's job. All women and children worked. The men worked too. I always remembered my grandmother having so much love for children, anybody's children. And I remember her, she would comb our hair, so much love in there, the way she stroked our hair, comb our hair, and she'd take us, we never got left behind. We were taken all over. And sometimes my grandmother would go to Cochin in a team of horses, a wagon. There would be about 8 kids behind there, eh? We're traveling down from Tanarachal, going to Cochin, to go and stay there with her side of the family, like there was family there too. So we'd go visit there, and then we'd go as far as Anya Lake in a wagon and Frog Lake, and then come back. That's how we traveled in a team of horses. And in winter time, we'd only go just around there. It would be a wagon and a caboose. And I found that life was very, we loved it. It was so free and loving.
And we're told we need to examine the past if we're going to plan for the future. That gives you some of the past. When we talk about the social safety net, you see, we need to reinstate that social safety net on how the traditional processes were in place in child rearing, the traditional processes in running a home. And like I said, who was in charge? The grandma. The female side of the family controlled and made the rules in the home and in the family and in the community. So we got a lot of work to do, but we need to apprehend our children. As we sit here today, there's about 11,000 babies not registered at all in Western Canada with no benefits, no status. We need to deal with those types of things under our laws and jurisdiction. We have 37,000 Indian children in child welfare under provincial law and jurisdiction in Western Canada. So it's pretty critical.
Kaya suya manaya kete mistake ya patsok kahkyogi gois kikikskno asuhtamagok eko haya muika tsotskskeitaman stahaya kamain kids skai awassak eko ha tihto gaya peko sampo kumanaya uhkumahumusomahikiu pikihot iksknohamagot kigoi ikskno asuhtamat kigoi eko hammeja takskisian kigoi ikatskape main kitsik uskayak awassak muihikigoin kisksen aiskiuttamihao kigoi squissak iksknohamaog tanskigoi kisaya pamnahki ekaskwasotsik ispihtsitsike ispihmine kistepotsik kahkioki kiskinohamatsik eko muja muikiko tsuanaihko matskiko ja hannohtsom kaittakoki aka kehte msteki aptsik kehte kohuka keskonua eko muja ka kihi hannohtsom ka kiska pegon kispamnitsik kisnohmatogam kohta kisnohamo kigoi upmatsunua katse mustahtsik kaya stansik peik makigoi matskiko tsihtakonnaiskonaihkotsik
uhkummaok kiipam neokoassa muimakootska noihtamageets kiihtook man kiekwa uhtaasimsiin muaiwa keeksuin kitaasimsewa kakihtseimat kitaasimskaks nahamoot kiikoi.
Civilization, Christianization, integration, assimilation, liquidation. 2018, still dealing with the same issues. How did they implement it? They first of all terminated and dismantled the sovereignty of our nations and the governments of our nations, destabilized our whole governing system, put us into little plots of land to further destroy the nation status we had as a people and government. Then they targeted who? The individuals, families, extended families, communities, societies of our nations. Residential school is only one method, so it's pretty comprehensive. And they made laws to outlaw our traditions, our language, our culture, our government, and so on. That's pretty comprehensive termination and liquidation.
Vuodakin aivan neuku kaki hot nihtski mannekin mussut nihtsäkäisikin musta mussakin koujaa se puettai koujaa kan touks no mauks ki aivan ne vanma aissa ja niuja toi otsikauten koujaan spiikas puettaan kiimaatun kiipokaatiin mä kevan kauji he pehtoo keiset kisunkin toimaa kuhtauja saminakin nuiskasi puetteet eikä tää puhtamanne kautkasi puhtioassa minäkin nueskin kiihtikaun muinun toihtene kun kasi puhteet kiihtaamais kismaakan siu kinues muinun stoimaa nuhtauja eikä kau eikä hekohat se näkskauak emätsen stoimak muika nun toimaa kaukasi puhteet joksenkin vitsi huonkin se puhtaan toks nahmauksiaan. Mä kattaa puheekin haiman ehtehäis neistonkin ne hioan. Eikin ne hiojan muominnuan kesksin, ne hiauun, ne hioiun. Ja kamkaakin paspi hikuaan. Mikä uipa nekin huittamoot kaivan kesksin. Ne hioskuumakin. Kaa kismo, ka kuina nahihta. No, ki haiman. Ki huap maun kauje mahattot maanakaa pennas kuin kaujaa. Ki haiman. Manki saa puhtaatiin. Kekam tahtas kiikin tohtaan. Mä sitten soskuu. Manki saa puhtaatiin. Tapoim staimat se kiivenkin pewapahteen efta. Matse piiksuun, matse toon. Eftenkin otsiksi keihten. Eko mä annan kiihtoan muika on nohte ainiin. Kiihtoan mä kiihtoa poko teet tohteaan. Mankin saa puhtaan. Kiikas kiihtaan ei saa puhtaan efta.
In the 1950s and 1960s, the residential schools began to become really overcrowded and they began to fall into disrepair. And in addition, Indigenous people started to hear some of the stories of the children who were coming out of the residential schools. So the schools began to close. At the same time in Canada, what happened was we had a new social work population that was growing, so social workers coming out of these new social work programs. And in that time of the 60s, we see an incredible increase in our children being apprehended and placed into foster care as well as adoptive homes. And this is what's known as the 60s scoop. And the 60s scoop has really carried on right into today, where our children are still being placed into non-Indigenous homes, primarily through the foster care system.
I didn't know where I came from. My adopted family always made sure that I knew that I was an Indian and that I was not one of their own. I was always introduced as the adopted child or the chosen child or the one that they picked. I was never, they'd name their 3 children and then Linda. And I was always given the adopted child or the chosen child. And so I knew I was Indigenous. I didn't know really where I came from, and I didn't know enough about First Nations culture to realize that there were individual reserves or individual areas that families lived. I didn't know anything about my culture whatsoever. So I found out when I was 18 that I was a band member of Soto First Nation. I always knew what my last name was. And that was only because the adoptive family made fun of it.
It wasn't evident at first because we were in shock that here we're not going to be able to go home anymore. But after we started doing chores constantly and spending our Saturdays and our Sundays working from the time we got up till the time we went to bed, then we knew that there was no love in the home. My brother, my older brother, was fortunate because he was allowed to go back and live with our grandparents, my maternal grandparents. They had a small house, but they only had room for him. So we said our goodbyes to him. And that summer he went to stay with our grandparents. And we never saw him again. That was the last time we would ever see him. So there we were in a foster home. We weren't allowed to go in any parts of the house. When we came in from doing our chores, we had to go immediately downstairs where we would wash up and get ready for meals. And as soon as we were done, we were back outside doing chores again and working on the farm. And we also had to fix fence. We had to haul bales. Sometimes it was, well, you know what it's like in July and August on the prairies. It gets pretty darn hot. And some of those bales, I'd say they were probably as heavy as we were, a good 90 pounds or so. Yeah. So in the hot sun, we worked, we labored, we slaved, and as soon as the bales were in, we did our chores and went straight to bed. We were never allowed to watch TV. The few times that they did allow us to watch TV on maybe on a Sunday evening for a while, we would sit on the steps going upstairs to the bedrooms. There we could see half of the TV. We weren't allowed in their living room. And then a very religious family, so we went to church every Sunday. And we said the rosary 2 or 3 times a week. And during the course of that rosary, sometimes an hour and a half, we'd be kneeling on a hard floor.
My job was to recruit native foster homes. So I did that for about 1.5 years, and then I moved into then I got a job with working with kids in care. Probably opened up about 10, 12 homes. I think, well, the criteria too, was hard. That you had to, well, your criminal record checks you had to do, and the size of your house, how many bedrooms you have and all that. And then I think a lot of Native people were reluctant to let white people come in and, and look at but I think with myself that they were comfortable with me to ask them all these questions and try and encourage them to open their homes. And a lot of those homes, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but a few of them were still, when I left, they were still, actually there's one man here that I run into sometimes at the hockey games, and they're still, they're still have kids. So,
That's good.
yeah. But yeah, it's not easy that, yeah. And then sometimes they have problems, they separate, so there's your home, one home gone again, so.
These young people end up being a determining factor of the economy of this province. We create more employment through more mental health therapists, more psychologists, more social workers, eventually from first contact with the police into the young offenders court system and into levels of incarceration that creates more jobs for correctional workers, correctional administrators, and all of the colonial infrastructure that's in place to supposedly protect and enhance the lives of these young people. So it's important to understand that there are economic determining factors here that are not at all benefiting either First Nations communities, treaty communities, or the Métis community. It's simply a determining factor in creating employment, pension benefits, and other luxuries for the civil service.
The resistance to the removal of our children through foster care and the child welfare system, the voices of Indigenous people got louder and louder, and in 1985 there was an inquiry in Manitoba where Justice Kimmelman said that the removal of Indigenous children amounted to genocide, cultural genocide. And so Indigenous communities across the country then made the decision to work towards having our own child welfare systems. And ideally, these systems would be based on our traditional culture and knowledges, and then meet the expectations of the Western system.
My involvement was a product of a traditional adoption. I'm also a product of the foster care system. And ironically now I'm running a child family services organization, and I've come a long ways in terms of knowledge of knowing both ways, Western and our own. And I attended social work with the First Nations University of Canada. I graduated from there in 1987, but I started doing research in child welfare since 1982. And I had the opportunity to attend the Chiefs Legislative Assembly at the Bisborough Hotel, and where we heard the future directions of child welfare in Saskatchewan. That's where the bilateral process came from then Chief Mel Istana, who tabled a draft Child Welfare Act for FSIN at that time, and I was quite interested in it. And ironically, in 1987, Vice Chief Henry Delorme formed the first Child and Family Services Steering Committee in Saskatchewan, which I became part of. And part of our responsibilities and duties was to draft up an FSIN Child Welfare and Family Support Act, which we finished in 1990. And it was presented to the Assembly and accepted. And that act was amended in 1994 and more recently in 2016. So it had amendments over the years and evolvement. At the same time, it allowed my organization time to develop our own laws, and it became a framework legislative support for our First Nations, and that's why it was developed.
The program started with discussions between the University of Regina's School of Social Work and the president, Lloyd Barber, and it was at the point in which the Federation of FSIN were wanting to take over some of the institutions, and they were the ones that were receptive to having share some of their autonomy to the First Nations institution. So they went ahead and developed a social work program. And the first intake was in 1970, January 1974. And I was part of a group of about 18 Indigenous students that were in the program. In the initial start, there was all non-Indigenous faculty that were teaching because there was no qualified academically Indigenous professor that was available. So that's where we got our start. And basically, when they were developing it, they were relying on the lead from us in terms of the information, where they had the theories and they had their own models, and then we tried to apply, the experiences and the knowledge that we had to the theories and models, and that's how we started the program in 74.
I think everybody recognized it as a problem many, many years before it even occurred because of what was happening in the past. And with that, I'm talking about the whole residential school era, the 60s scoop, were major factors, especially the residential school, because when you imagine the number of children and the number of parents that were separated and the bond was broken in the family. Can you imagine the bonds broken in so many families across our nation? Not just in Saskatchewan, but all over Canada and the States. And I always try and reinforce the fact that you can't forget that era. When you've gone through, 4 generations of residential school, sometimes 5, it's very, very hard for parents to know how to parent when your child has been gone 10 months of the year.
They found a way to advocate for children, which meant Sandra and I used to have to walk into those boardrooms, we had to walk into courts, we had to do all of these different things. And if situations were difficult on the First Nation as well, we had to speak to those issues as well. We couldn't just walk away from it and say, oh yeah, well, the federal government, everybody is so bad. No. We had to say, okay, how are you going to handle this over here? Because this is what exists right now. So we had to say those things for First Nations, for the feds, and for the province. That's what the FSIN did with that one program. And they gave it different names, but essentially it was always the same. It was really, it's difficult to see a lot of the detail for casework. So we never spoke about it because it was all confidential. We didn't, so maybe nobody knew, but that's what we did. And we worked on it like I did, sometimes 24/7 to be prepared for when you're actually going to meet with the province or powers that be. But it's amazing how they look at us and they just brush us aside like nothing, like we're nothing. And we don't have a say, and we're stupid. We don't know. We can't understand theory. We can't understand, different ways of arriving at good decisions for the safety of children. That we, in some way, are subjective all the time. We cannot be objective. At one point I said, you know what? We can be objective and subjective within the context of our own systems. What you're doing is being objective outside of our systems, and you are gauging and you're judging and you're oppressing and you're doing all of those things. You're controlling and you're feeling like you did your job, and of course you're going to get paid for doing that. So by implication, the systems continue to oppress, continue to subjugate First Nations, and that's what you're doing. And we've seen it on the ground. We ran into it daily.
The establishment of the agency in La Ronge Indian Band. First of all, the band had determined that they would like the agency to have an elected board. This is quite unique to Lac La Ronge Indian Band, Child and Family Services in Saskatchewan, that La Ronge Child and Family Services is the only agency that has an elected board of directors to the for the agency board. So, upon the establishing the elected board, the agency was incorporated and is incorporated in Saskatchewan, independently incorporated, and is at arm's length from the political leadership of Lac La Ronge Indian Band.
With La Ronge Band, because we're 6 separate communities, the ICFS, our Indian Child Family Services Board, is made up of people that are elected from the communities. So we have 1 rep from each of the communities. So we have somebody elected from Little Red, Hall Lake, Sucker River, Stanley Mission, Grandmother's Bay, and La Ronge. So we have board members from all the communities, representing all the communities, and they're elected through nomination, and then we have elections on Treaty Day. And then they also have an elder that's appointed by the board. But if they want to build a building on reserve, or if they need like different things, they still have to come to the council. And plus, we took over the province asked us to take over their child welfare for off reserve, so we do that too.
We need to look at the different ways of delivering services. Prior to 1994, social services had been delivering child welfare services. After 1994, for a certain period of time, the agencies, in the absence of not knowing how to deliver child welfare services, followed the same pattern of service delivery under social services. So really, you had a First Nations social services system. And we've come to the point now, I think, that we want to think outside the box in terms of child welfare services and look at a First Nation perspective, which involves kinship care. When you look at taking a child out of their home, once you take a child out of their home, they are very difficult, if sometimes impossible, to reintegrate and make that family the same way that they were, and improve on the issues that led to that child in care. When you take a child out and you're able to place them with family, be it uncles or aunties or grandmas, then it makes it a lot easier to work with that family and to maintain the integrity of the family group. So those are the kinds of things, I think, when we're looking at, the history of child welfare. What do we want to change? What do we want to do differently? Where do we want to go? And part of it is setting aside the systemic process that we were trained in social work school, and with our experiences with social services, and looking towards the future and changing the way that we practice social work, that we're a part of the community. We're not a separate piece that just comes in when there's issues and then removes children. I think that's part of what we need to embrace in child welfare system, the First Nations child welfare system.
Bill Standing Ready from White Bear used to say the same things. And he would talk about it in terms of tradition, in terms of treaty, right? And we had a memorandum of understanding where we agreed to agree and continued to. He would speak about those things. He was very adamant that you do not give in. Do not allow the province to continue to dictate. We have to do something. So that's what we tried to do. The Yorkton Tribal Council chiefs did the same thing. They wouldn't give up. They still haven't. They tried to make them conform. They won't, because they're moving towards trying to develop their own system. And they're having to pull the province along, and the feds. That's like pulling 10 trucks, semi-trucks, trying to go where you're wanting to go, right? And you got to pull those people, those trucks along. That's kind of the thing that happens. Sometimes I look at the directors when they're doing stuff, and I have a lot of compassion for them. wow, it's so complex what they do and how they handle it and how they create and, you know, it's amazing how they keep standing up.
Our people, our young children were being taken away from social services at that time. So we figured we got to do something about this, and there was a lot of meetings, done a lot of paperwork. We had to send papers away because we never had no emails, nothing at all, no computers that back then, and it took a long time until 1994, I think in December, then they officially opened Kanawamik. Everything was agreed from the government to start our child and family services. So everything went smoothly, and some other bands joined in with Kanawamik, and today there's five or six First Nations that are. Plus, this here in the city, there's a lot of our kids here in town that are living in the city right now, and they've been taken away sometimes, and they want their kids back. So Kanawamik just took over and did counseling with our young people, our young mothers and dads, and they come to this building here to come and get counseling and all for about some of them. Some of them came from a long ways, just like north here, northern part, southern part, all 4 directions. And what Kanawamik did is they got their cars, they take out the parents to go and visit their children, bring them back, and sometimes they'll bring the children here to come and see the parents to come and see their kids. Yeah? And they've been doing that for quite a while now. And today, Kanawamik is so getting stronger every day, and I'm glad that it's been done like that.
We have 5 First Nation communities, and each of them contracts with us one-on-one, and we report back to them on the services we provide for their community. So it all aligns with how First Nations are taking control over their child welfare services, although it requires us to use provincial legislation because of the funding policy associated with it. The First Nations' goal all the time was to assume total control without provincial legislation. And we've been waiting for that to happen since we started, but that's up to the political level to be dealt with. And then once the direction we received from the leadership was develop the services, fine-tune your services so you're ready for the time when we can assume full control and have our own legislation.
Back in 2007, the Institute formed as a not-for-profit organization with a separate board of directors that is made up of agency directors and now currently other professional subject matter experts. And the goal of the Institute was to support research, standards, development, and training for First Nations child and family service workers on reserve. In 2008, we opened our doors and we've been in operation since.
So some of the program areas we initially started in were with group homes. So there's several First Nations group homes on reserve in Saskatchewan that required just a little bit more infrastructure. And so they identified standards as being needed in their areas. And so the Institute worked towards helping them develop their standards. From that point, that just kind of snowballed into then developing training that reflected those standards. And then after training, we started to do more gatherings, like 1 and 2 day conferences. And now they have a regular working group that meets 4 times a year to discuss strengths, challenges, maybe some opportunities for training together. So definitely that area has professionalized but also grown in many ways, and the Institute's been part of that growth.
One of the exercises that we did a few years back with our board of directors was to go through a 20-year visioning exercise to take a look at where would the Institute be in 20 years here in Saskatchewan to support child welfare and other disciplines that impact child welfare. So that was a really good exercise for us to do. It helped us to identify redoing our vision and mission statements, looking at our values as an organization, a First Nations organization, as well as the guiding principles which will define the nature of work and the relationships we will have with youth, with elders, with community members, with funders, with government, non-government organizations, our staff. On top of that 20-year vision, we've been able to move back in increments. So come to the first 5 years of where do we need to grow and focus our efforts. So we're looking at our own internal infrastructure, our programs and services and audiences. We'll then move into the next 5 year, which will take us to the 10-year. Where do we need to be to get to our 20-year vision? So that has really helped us as an institute focus our time, efforts, and energies in the areas that have been identified by the people we serve, where the best areas are to support.
We still have to go further. We have to go more in depth into these issues before we can really start to help. But I think the province is where the most work has to be done because they have to relinquish some of that responsibility that they're given as a province. And they have to start trusting in First Nation governments to be able to come up with a solution. And I think the First Nation governments are the ones that have to make that and come up with that solution. We've gone too long in having things thought up for us and things done for us. It's time that we're given our own budgets and our own way of developing policy and laws.
When you look at the present child welfare system, it's important that people understand the past. Through our historic and traditional system, the families were intact. They emphasized the Wakotuan kinship system, Manachituan, Kitamagnatuan. All of those aspects were part of child rearing. Child rearing. That was a community driven process. So you have Indigenous children that knew who they were, that were nurtured, that were loved, that were started to be given some of that knowledge and the skills that they need through storytelling, through the child rearing practices that were inherently part of the culture.
I'm really concerned about the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care in 2018. And, as a researcher, I understand that that's the result of legislation and policy that work against Indigenous children and families. So one thing I'm pushing for across the country is that Indigenous child welfare agencies, all child welfare agencies, implement legally binding foster care agreements so that foster families no longer have the option to apply for permanency, guardianship, or adoption of our children. And I think that'll go a long way to stopping that movement of our children into non-Indigenous care. And that's really important to me. And I think probably to most people, to most Indigenous people.
One of the things I think that is huge, and I see it happening, is the revitalization of the culture, the revitalization of what we had. It's amazing the resilience of the people, their ability to go through what they went through in those residential schools, and to come out and to remember their parenting. And some of them lost it. Like, for example, I'll give you a real quick example. My mother was taken when she was 6 by the Indian agent on the back of a cattle truck and taken to her first residential school, which was Birtle. My mother was there in three different residential schools for 10 years. When she came out, she said she was like a zombie. She said she came out, she said, I didn't know how to parent, I didn't know how to touch, I didn't know how to hug. She said, we weren't allowed to do those things, I didn't know how to show emotion. And my father, who went to Lebrecq Residential School and went through a really tough experience, him and my mother got together when they came to the residential school, and they had 10 children. And I can see those impacts that on us, but I also can say that my father, even though he had a horrific experience in his residential school, which story that he doesn't share publicly, but I know privately, for him to all of a sudden to revitalize his traditional family parenting, because I never even knew my parents went to residential school. I never heard their story until 15 years ago when my mother came and she started sharing her story. And so to see that and then realize that, they went through such a horrific experience, yet my father maintained those traditional practices, the naming ceremonies, the sweat lodge, the gatherings, our community gatherings, our family gatherings, he kept that all intact, teaching us the history, teaching us, about the treaties and, all these important things. And the traditional family parenting that he did, the hunting with my brothers, my mother teaching us the roles of women, my aunts, to see all that, it was amazing to me to see that some of them really kept it intact, and that's the resilience of the people.
When we talk about the culture, we recognize that each of our First Nations have their own culture, and we know and respect those ways. In one of our programs, what we did last year was we worked with a family to return their children. In the old way, we could work with the children, with the family, up to 2 years, the parents, and then we'd have to start making long-term plans with the family for the children. They call them looking for forever homes. We use the traditional alcohol and drug assessment, counseling, kind of parent aid sort of things. Those are traditionally, I don't like to use that word tradition, what the province expected most of our parents to go through. When because mainly the symptoms of why the children have come into care pertain to alcohol and drugs, and a lot of residential school issues. We recognize that, and we try and look at ways that will help that family, that specific family. So last year we worked with this family. We hired a cultural liaison, and he worked with that family. We actually helped Dad, receive a traditional name, and we worked with the family to a day in June last year that we actually had ceremony in returning the children. And the whole lot of the community came out to support the family. And what happened was we were able to, started off with a sweat the evening before, sweat lodge ceremony, and then the day of the children, what we did was we had 2 teepees and an altar in the middle of in the distance of the 2 teepees, and we brought the family together with elders and prayer, song. In a meaningful way, I think that what happens is when we look at our culture, we look at there's so much more meaning to then, okay, we're going to return your children, and here they are at your doorstep, and okay, now you look after them.
Now we have another generation, through the Sixth Scoop. We have more kids now in the foster care and adoptive home system than we ever did in the residential school. But the impacts are the same. People growing up in there don't have a sense of who they are as Indigenous people. They're taught to be ashamed of themselves as Indigenous people. They're taught to be a sense of inferiority. Plus, while dealing with issues of abandonment, issues of not belonging, issues of perhaps physical, emotional, sexual abuse that occurs similar to what happened to us in the residential school. So, it's a continuation of that assimilation policies, and the impacts of it, over intergenerations are now what we're trying to grapple with. And the system is saying, we've got a whole group of people that are in foster care and adoptive care, not to mention all the ones that are in jails that are overcrowded at the provincial and federal institutions, and group homes. What do we do? It's a crisis. So now they said, okay, perhaps we'll deal with it through accommodation. So accommodation means that they begin to establish Indian child welfare systems in the same way that they started to develop the Indian social works programs, for people to be able to work within those systems, so that at least on the front line we have Indigenous people dealing with the problems that they created, and are expected to use statistics and accountabilities to be able to demonstrate that they are indeed effective and moving forward, and that the numbers are starting to turn around, in order for them to continue the funding.
So as you can see, we're taking over child welfare in First Nations communities and across the provinces. We still have a tremendous amount of work to do. The generations of residential school survivors and the 60 Scoop survivors, there's a lot of healing and that needs to be done because of the traumas that people experienced. But we have the will and we have the leadership in place. And so as sovereign nations, we never gave up jurisdiction over our children. And our goal then is to reacquire that jurisdiction and to have sovereignty over the lives of our children and our families. I believe that we're in a really good place right now. We have the collective will and the knowledge and decades of experience in running Indigenous child welfare agencies. So we're on a good path to collective healing.
We just have to keep working on, different things that are going to work for our community and building capacity in the north. And that's why we keep pushing for the Wellness Treatment Recovery Center. And it's one of the things that I keep pushing for, because I remember my sister, she was trying to change her life. She had quit drinking and quit drugs, and she was trying to make a better life for her kids. And she was trying to reach out for different agencies, trying to get help for herself, and then she ended up taking her life because maybe it was too much for her. And that's one of the things that drives me to build this treatment center, Wellness Treatment Recovery Center, for people like her and, people that want to help themselves and want to make a change. And for our young people too, because I know we do have a high rate of suicides, and there's a reason why we have that, but we also have to have something and to give hope for people and somewhere that's safe for them to want to make a change, or just to give them a safe place where they can be themselves and start opening up and, make a better lives for themselves and their families.
Igu ma nakatamoa ko guta toskiwa kawi chihad se unigi higumawa maka tawi chihad se muy poco piawan se maka muy poco pignawa son maka tan se tis naga team so se o unigi higumawa skuwa ke wa na piwa muy poco skuwa na piwa tan se tisi mi upmat sik tawa pamgut skut tawa sim suho tan si waskawi sik tan si sepmat sik magi kwa utatuski wa goge igun goge taki mia siki kwai tan ti takskino ma me tan si mi upmat son gi si hatama huma miup matsun. Tans te tise mats chuko kunigi hikumawag. Tawichi ha chuko tosim suo. Igwa tawa pam ko chik tan si se miup mats chigi se miwas kawichik. Ikon ko kuta toskiwag. We want muta toskiuno. Takskinu hamawachik. Okay, unigi hikumawag. Tan ti tohtichik tawichi tasochik. Tamiachik. Tans ti suichi hachik. Mihchit ki kway payo. Tans ti suichi hit kwa humagano. Skogak te max ti kwa napyo. Magi kwa awase hay awachik. Pi awase wita kohtit. Ikisi tawa matsun. Pagui hakamimo kan oma. Unigi hukua koge. Takamimo chika kuimio ayachik. Tamiyo pikinawasochik. Tamiyo pikihachik soasim suo. Mui mini tahi kuto susimoa. Tawapam kochik tan si se miyo matschik. Isiganatschik. Ikanachip matschik. Ngito. Ego se. Hey.
It's important for all of us that have either experienced living during the residential school era or the 60s scoop that we make every effort to reprogram ourselves from the genocidal practices that were heaped on us. It's important that we revisit our traditional ways, our cultural ways. I know I have adopted that way, and it literally has made me see the world from natural law and from the teachings of our people.
So we've come a long way in child welfare in Canada. You know, as Indigenous people, we've faced so many challenges and obstacles with the residential schools and the 60s scoop. And we have collectively a lot of, recovery to do from that. As a survivor of the 60s scoop, one thing that I have experienced is being able to go back to my culture and understanding just how powerful it is. And, when as an academic, when I see child welfare agencies across the country operating, the ones that are operating on our traditional knowledge foundation are doing such incredible work despite limited funding. As Indigenous people, we never gave up our sovereignty over our children and our families. And, that's the place where we're at is recognizing that we have the right, we have the jurisdiction, we have the sovereignty to have control over our children and families. And so as we move forward, we're looking at legislation that will validate what we already know, that we are sovereign nations with control over our children and our families. And we believe that this is the best way to go for future generations.